Hey there, I'm Gilad Barash, and welcome to Who's Your Data, the podcast that deals with how data influences life and how life influences data, the human side of data analytics. AI is rapidly changing the landscape of innovative health tech. In this episode, I chat with Dr. Yoni Goldwasser, a digital health investor and entrepreneur, about the exciting new trends in health tech and whether or not AI will advance enough to replace doctors in the future. We discuss how accurate medical models need to be in his opinion, how he and his team of investors evaluate new health tech startups in terms of algorithms and bias in the data, and he provides tips on what makes a good startup pitch. Let's get to the interview. Okay, Yoni, welcome to the Who's Your Data podcast, and it's good to have you on.
Thank you for having me.
So can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background and how you got involved in health tech and AI?
Yeah, sure. I guess it starts with the fact that my father's a physician who also made the transition into VC. I did a BA in chemistry, kind of fell in love with science, decided to do a PhD in medical engineering at Harvard and MIT, which was kind of awesome, but also realized I didn't want to stay in academia. So then went into kind of the business world and worked. My first job was actually at Teva Pharmaceuticals, where I built my first health tech product, although we didn't call it that at the time, but it was essentially building their BI from scratch. And then continued in BCG, did management consulting, co-founded a couple of startups, worked in VC, both in Israel and in Germany. And now I'm here in Berlin leading an angel group that invests in health tech.
How do you feel about the current landscape of health tech startups, and what are some exciting trends?
Exciting trends. So I think one of the things that excites us as a group of investors is any technology that augments healthcare providers. Healthcare providers can be essentially thought of in several dimensions. One is where they provide some sort of analytical component, so they try to get to a diagnosis and provide a prognosis and find a treatment plan. It's something that is very, very algorithmic, and that is something that, for example, AI lends itself very natural to because AI is all about finding patterns and matching them with other patterns. So this is something that in our minds is something very obvious that it is going to become more and more a feature of healthcare. Then there's a part of the healthcare provider, which is essentially this bedside manner, supporting patients more on a psychological level. This is something that for many years I heard the counter argument that is this like human touch is something that can never be really replaced, and we're seeing that that's also not true. So we're already seeing, there have been recently these publications that when AI answers patients' questions, at least I think it was on Reddit, patients actually prefer the tone and style of the AI over what is offered by actual physicians. So I think that's also something that we're going to see coming more and more through. And then the third piece is, let's call it any kind of manipulation of the physical world. So it's essentially robotics. And we're already seeing some simple robots that, help mobilize patients, get them in and out of beds, that type of thing. And of course, very complex robots like Da Vinci that actuate movements from over distance. But I think we're going to start to see more and more also robotic systems that are either semi-independent and eventually independent of human operators. Initially, I think the places where it's going to catch on is, first of all, situations where you just don't have access to physical care providers. And also in situations where it's technically a little bit more feasible. For example, when you're talking about operating on, for example, a spine, that's a situation where there's the operating field is quite stable and fixed. So that's much easier to treat than obviously some of these, intra-abdominal type operations. And by the way, there's a fourth element that unfortunately is also a part of physicians' lives that is very prominent, which is everything that has to do with administration. In that, there we're already seeing huge leaps in what technology can help doing, and what I've advocating for years now and is finally happening is essentially the kind of Alexa that sits on a physician's desk and creates an automated note, like a summary of the visit, which is again something that all this documentation that physicians use to have to take hours and hours of their day to do. These should hopefully all be automated in the next couple of years.
So that's a lot of different tasks that AI can do, and that health tech is taking over. And that leads to the question that you actually asked in a recent Medium article: will AI replace doctors? And so you state that there's a constant debate on what role AI will play in medicine, as far as whether it's a tool that doctors will use or to the extent that it will replace doctors and nursing resources. Can you expand about that debate and what led you to write that article?
The point I was making is exactly what I just talked about, was that if you take kind of a reductionist approach to what makes up a physician, it's those four elements that we just discussed. And then the question became, why is there some sort of theoretical limit that would disallow technology to completely replace physicians in one of these aspects? And my argument, and that I haven't heard anybody seriously refute yet, is that there is no such limit. It might be an issue of time. It might be an issue of people willing to accept the replacement of healthcare professionals by machines. But from a technological point of view, I don't really see where that limit is. And to be completely fair, I also think that I don't know what jobs will remain eventually. Like if you're looking in a time horizon of 20, 30 years, I don't know what any of us are going to be doing anymore. So it's not just doctors and nurses, of course. And to be fair, there's also a lot of, I am definitely not saying that this is going to happen anytime in the next 5 or even 10 years. I think there's a lot of reasons why we want to make this transition a little bit slower than even if it could be faster from a technological point of view. But I also think that we're going to start seeing these things applied again where the resources don't give better options. So we're thinking right now, we're sitting here in Berlin, and we're talking about systems that have an abundance of resources, of physicians and nurses, increasingly less so, but still when you compare it to some other regions in the world. And those regions don't have the luxury of trying to staff their healthcare system the way that we do here. And for those regions, having access to this, what we consider now as maybe a second best option, is actually much better than what is available to them today. And so I do see that these technologies are probably going to catch on quicker in resource poor areas. There's of course like an ethical question here about deploying technologies that are being tried out for the first time in these types of areas. But again, I think that given the fact that we don't have a better option to offer, I think it's actually a fair way to try and again, deploy these technologies and hopefully help people who don't have a better option.
Now you mentioned that being a doctor requires a lot of different skills, from diagnosing, performing surgery, communicating with patients, and like you said, some of these tasks are better suited for today for AI. Ones that are more around pattern recognition, like detecting lesions in MRI scan, where there's very clear labeled data that can be used. But then there are some tasks, like you mentioned, the bedside tasks, and looking at clinical data that's derived from humans, charts, lab notes, etc., which tends to be a lot dirtier and not as clear. It's messy and it's incomplete. But these, like you said, are crucial for triaging and diagnosing. Are these algorithms as advanced, or are they advancing in the same way that the traditional pattern recognition, supervised learning, labeled data that does the lesion detection, for example? Are these catching up to those?
I think so. I one of the things that I'm constantly surprised by is just how good some of these systems are at doing tasks that I believe are new to them. It's like summarizing information, understanding context. They're doing much better than I would have thought possible. That is not to say that I would feel comfortable just today, feeding one of these models a medical record and expecting it to provide accurate responses about that data. The cost of making an error in healthcare is much higher than maybe in many other areas. So I definitely think that this requires a lot of careful thought and understanding, and we also don't want to create systems that are complete black box. One of the things that I've found interesting, by the way, to see in these LLM models, I mean, of course, you can't. It's very hard to decode exactly what they're doing in kind of like the background, but they are not so bad at explaining why they are doing why they choose to give answers that they're giving. I think all these models are super interesting, and I think they're really going to help us make huge leaps in the coming couple of years in terms of cleaning up and understanding this messy medical data.
You mentioned the high cost of mistakes in medical models. So let's talk about that a little bit, accuracy in the model. So in ad tech, where I come from, if you can get an accuracy of 60% in a model, that's great. We're happy. Nothing's going to happen if we show an ad for a hearing aid to a teenager. But in the medical field, of course, the stakes are much higher. You can have false positives, such as misdiagnosing cancer in a healthy patient, and you can also have false negatives, which are, for example, misdiagnosing a sick person as healthy. And these mistakes can cost human lives. How accurate do medical models have to be, in your opinion, for them to be acceptable for use?
I think that they need to be at least as good as what's available to the patient otherwise. Again, in the Western world, we think about this as this needs to be better than a physician. But you also need to take into account that even again in the West, we have very different healthcare scenarios. Just as a small example, if you take the gold standard of identifying kind of stroke from imaging data, I think what, for example, also with when you're trying to pass through the FDA, what you're trying to show is that it's better than some sort of gold standard, which is the 2 or 3 very highly trained physicians that are all looking at the data and coming to some sort of conclusion about whether or not there's a stroke in the image that they're looking at. The reality of healthcare is actually often very different from that. So very often, a patient with a stroke is going to show up to a rural hospital, in the middle of the night, where the only person looking at this imaging, at least until morning, is a young physician with very little training, where you see that actually their accuracy is very, very low. And so if you ask me, if in that type of situation, if the physician's accuracy is, 70%, and you come up with an algorithm that is 80%, that's an improvement. It's just hard for us to kind of really admit that and to come to terms with that. But that is actually, again, if I were the patient in that situation, I would prefer the AI to make the decision rather than the young doctor. But it's, of course, a little bit more complex than that, and we can't offer different types of safety to different parts of our, within a same healthcare system. But I do think that some of these applications are going to show up in some regions, in some countries, in some applications. I think of battlefield applications. I think they're going to show up faster in some areas than others.
One of the things I always hear when talking about utilizing modeling scores for making decisions, whether it be, I think, in healthcare, certainly in the financial world, when the algorithm may decide that somebody is of high risk for defaulting on a loan, is that it should really be used as one data point in the decision-making process, and not necessarily the end-all be-all and say, okay, the algorithm decided, but probably is worth further review. As you mentioned, this also speaks to transparency and readability of the results, so that doctors can know how the algorithm arrived at the decision.
So having some sort of understanding of how the decision was made, I think, is going to be critical in medicine. But with regards to always having a person there to kind of check. I think we're all going to feel much more comfortable with that in the foreseeable future. But I think that statistically, that may not even always make sense. For example, imagine a situation where the algorithm is actually better at making decisions than a person, and then a person, say a physician, comes and overrides the decision of the machine and actually makes it worse. I think we'll very quickly actually reach a point in some applications where that might be the case. And again, in certain scenarios and in certain conditions, I think that we're very soon going to reach situations where the algorithm alone might be better at making decisions than in this human in the loop type of situation. And then we're going to have to ask ourselves, it's a very good question. I mean, do we want to have this like are we scientists? Do we trust the statistics and the information that we're being presented, or are we going with what makes us feel better as people, which is maybe to have a human who could possibly override the decision of the machine before the decision is becomes final. Again, I have my preference, but I think this is going to be a kind of not an easy debate, because I think different people will have very different thoughts about this.
That's a really interesting point that you make, and it makes me think of a sort of an end point scenario for AI that is called planned obsolescence. And it's something that researchers are talking about, where it's a potential future endpoint with AI systems where humans have to rely on AI systems in order to make decisions and in order to be competitive. Because whether it's economic, marketplace, military, medicine, if everybody's using AI, you're at a disadvantage if you're not. And if the AI systems become, for example, if you're a general and you entered a war, you would have to listen to your AI strategy advisors because they're better at strategy than you would be as a human. And if another country that you're at war with uses AI advisors, you would be at a disadvantage if you didn't. And then AI models also can be trained to undertake scientific research and basically mimic human decision making by scientists and further advance research at a higher pace. And it's like running a business today and refusing to use computers, then you are going to be at such a disadvantage. In this situation, by the way, if AI systems were to collaborate with each other and in order to make some kind of decision, then supposedly humans would have no power to stop.
First of all, let's put aside these, the rise of the machines type of scenarios. I mean, I think that's I'm not sure how realistic this is, and I don't think that's within the scope of what we want to talk about today. But you could imagine a situation in the future where in a environment, especially like in the U.S., where most of healthcare is private in some sense, and there is competition between healthcare providers, and you could envision two healthcare systems, and one of that serves, say, the same population, and you can imagine that one of them has adopted AI and is using AI to provide better, more efficient, again, statistically provable, better treatment than its competitor that's decided to shun AI and go completely the classic healthcare way, or by the way, any kind of hybrid model that, let's say in this hypothetical, is inferior in terms of results to the pure AI method. And then, you could ask, with time, which one of them is going to gain an advantage? The one that has, that insists on doing everything kind of like the traditional way, versus the one that is actually producing better results for patients, provides the same, again, better healthcare for less money. I guess in that type of scenario, you would actually see more and more healthcare organizations adopting AI as a competitive way to gain an advantage in the market. And I think that actually kind of makes sense. And look, I do think that there's a possibility that, very much like with everything from watchmaking to car making. There will be maybe, some people who can afford to have everything done manually and prefer everything to have done manually, and that's going to be kind of like a luxury item. But for the vast majority of people, they're going to be, let's say, technically non-inferior option that, get you 99% of the way there for much, much less, because the elements that produce them are all automated.
So let's talk about the other side of the equation with these models, and that is the data. Many patients claim that they experience racial bias or other forms of bias from their provider. One of the main challenges with data in any field, but specifically in the medical field, is having representation and diversity in the data that will reflect the patients and their lived experience. How do you think about that when you approach medical or health tech startups and how they deal with issues of bias in the data?
It's absolutely a concern. I think so. I think most of the conversation that we've had thus far is around what is possible and what could happen based on the natural evolution of the technology. You're 100% right that there's this whole element that has to do with whether we should do it or how exactly we should deploy it that we've really not touched upon at all. With regards to bias in data, I think that everything that has to do with equity in healthcare, it's a super complex topic. Using data that is biased in some way is 100% a concern. I think that it needs to be a combination of the industry setting certain standards for itself, plus having regulators come and ensure that there's adequate level of representation in data. I would say that with early stage startups specifically, I think that there should be some sort of space left again from a regulatory perspective that lets startups not address these topics necessarily from day one and let them iterate in that direction, because I think that what they're often trying to do is very resource intensive and risky. And if you force startups to kind of like live up to the same standards that you would a Google or a Microsoft, that would be hugely stifling to innovation, again, around startups. There is space to say that as long, for example, as long as you're not serving above a certain size population, you get certain breaks from the regulation. And then, of course, you have to have a plan to catch up with that later, because the regulations do kick in once you get beyond that size.
Out of curiosity, do you have ideas that come up as a VC? Do you see ideas for startups where you're like, you shouldn't do that? Like, it's a bad idea.
That's a really good question. No, I think the only time there was one time I remember leaving a pitch upset was, but it didn't have to do with what we were doing. It was the fact that essentially this company wasn't it's not like they just came together and they're already a team of, I want to say 10 to 15 people, and they were all white male.
Mm-hmm.
And there was actually a picture of a woman on their team slide, and they told us that they just let her go. I kind of was like, yeah, it's almost like I can't even remember what they talked about, because I was like, yeah, this is not going to fly for me. But this didn't really have to do with the technology that they were producing. Right. It had to do with how they were building the company.
Yeah, that's a really great point. I had a similar situation coming into a company to do a pitch, and with another female consultant that we had, and we were waiting by the boardroom to walk in, and there were pictures of all the board members and the leadership portraits of them all on the walls, and we were looking around, and the consultant and I looked at each other and laughed, and nobody else, our other teammates were, what's so funny? And I said, look around at the portraits. Does something strike you as odd? All old white men, and they didn't see it.
I think the point is that if that's the makeup of your company leadership, but in this case even the entire company, it automatically makes me wonder how concerned you are really about topics that have to do with equity.
Just kind of off the top of your head, what would you say makes for a good health tech startup pitch? What happens that you would come away being impressed, other than really excellent technology?
One of my co-investors in my angel group, Professor Ariel Stern, she gave a talk recently that I think that she made the point that two things that startups, specifically in this field, sometimes fail to ask themselves is who exactly is using my product, and that is often not a very straightforward question, because often the product is used along a certain care pathway and you need to understand the entire pathway. And the second is who is paying for my product. I thought that when she was speaking about this, it was very insightful, because I think those are the two things that many startups actually don't think all the way through. So those are the 2 points. So I think startups should always understand exactly where they fit on like a care pathway, what kind of changes to a care pathway they're proposing, how this is going to affect all the different stakeholders, and of which there are often many. And again, who's going to pay for this and why? Why is it in their interest to pay for this?
I've had conversations like this with product people where, they design the product in a certain way, and when they get the feedback back from the users, some of them were my team and others, and their response is, well, they're using the product wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, no, you didn't scope out the right use cases. You don't realize this is what they need. You're not covering their needs. And so I agree, that's a really, really important and insightful way to approach designing the product. All right, so it's time for hot topics. So the first thing I want to ask you about is that SciTech Daily study warns that doctors are not prepared for AI transformation of medicine. How do you feel about that? Do you think there are any ways that could be addressed? Do you see, for example, maybe a little bit more data science training as part of medical school, or how can we get doctors more prepared for AI?
So again, I think first of all, I'd make the argument that none of us are really prepared for the impact that AI is going to have on our daily lives.
Yes.
I think we can't even really quite predict it. I sometimes think about the fact that 1 year ago, if you'd asked me about generative AI, anything, I probably would have given you a very, very different answer than I would today. And I feel that today, just keeping up with these new innovations and what people are doing with these models could be a full-time job for someone. So I think none of us are really completely prepared. I think that for physicians, the challenge is that they always need to stay kind of up to date with the most advanced knowledge from their field, and it's something that in a sense they're kind of used to doing. But the problem is that the type of learning that the continuing medical education that they're required to do just has never really included, I'd say this cautiously, I think that generally it underemphasizes IT developments. And now we're coming up against this. This is probably going to be such a revolutionary change in what we are able to do and the types, how this technology will impact medicine. I 100% think that it needs to be integrated more into everything from medical schools to CME trainings.
Sure. Well, Yoni, I want to thank you so much for this conversation that we got to have before Skynet became self-aware and our machine overlords took over. So I'm glad we had an opportunity.
I was pro-machine. I hope the machines remember that.
I know, yeah, we are all pro-machines. I hope they remember that. I hope that one job that they don't take over is podcast hosting. So hopefully I'll still have something to do. People, if my adoring audience out there want to look up more of your work or follow you or get in touch with you, what's the best way to look you up?
My group is called Springboard Health Angels, and you can find our website at springboardangels.com. That's a good place to start.
All right. Thanks again. Great visiting you in Berlin.
Thank you very much.
Well, thanks for joining us today and listening to this episode. Please remember to subscribe, rate, and review our podcast. And if you have any questions you'd like addressed, send them to who'syourdatanow@gmail.com. That's who'syourdatanow, all one word, @gmail.com. Thanks, and see you next time on Who's Your Data?